My name is Joe Slowik, and we will talk to the XENOTIME threat actor, zeroing in on XENOTIME and the analysis of the entities, responsible for the Triton event. So who am I? Other than someone who is very much enthusiastic about Ronnie James Dio, I currently lead threat detection engineering and threat intelligence operations for Gigamon and their Threat Insight product. Previously, I've worked at Domain Tools, the US government, and the Department of Energy and the US Navy, and done some other things as well, but that's not all that important. Instead, today, we're going to talk about a couple of things, centering around a threat actor that will just, for convenience sake, use the XENOTIME moniker to have this discussion. We'll begin with when we first learned about this entity and talk to the Triton event from 2017. Then get into activity linked to this actor following the 2017 incident in Saudi Arabia. Then we'll look into who was responsible for this activity and how this aligns with developers, actors, and operators when it comes to complex cyber intrusion operations, and conclude with a discussion on complex attribution concerns. So not the most technical talk that you'll see at Virus Bulletin, but something that all of us as threat intelligence practitioners or contributors need to be mindful of when examining certain types of intrusion. So first, Triton, TRISIS, Hatman, because of course we have different names. It's been labeled the malware that can kill, or the world's most dangerous malware, which it's a little misleading because the malware itself, as analyzed by multiple parties, including Mandiant, Dragos, and the United States Cybersecurity and Information Security Agency, CISA, was really a tool designed to allow for unnoticed or unlogged modification or arbitrary modification to a safety instrumented system in an industrial environment. We'll speak to what a safety instrumented system, or SIS, is shortly. But the main idea is that the Triton malware was designed as one piece as part of a broader intrusion. So we start with, whoops, that wasn't the right button. We start with compromising the information technology environment, fairly standard stuff there, then pivoting into the operational technology network in order to enable the more worrisome cyber-physical scenarios that gave this incident such notoriety. But as part of that, this wasn't just deploy Triton, install it, and walk away, but rather the threat actor compromised the plant's distributed control system environment that operated the the petroleum products manufacturing complex that was breached. And then Triton was used in parallel with this in order to try to disable or modify safety controls within that environment. And then, well, quite frankly, we don't know, because like many events that have taken place within the industrial space since Stuxnet, someone had to say it today, this didn't quite work out as planned, and we're going to explore why here momentarily. Now first, just an aside on safety systems, it's important to note that safety systems, safety instrumented systems specifically, operate as an intermediate step between the sort of, we can bring a plant under control should something adverse happen, versus getting into physical engineering controls like brake valves, blowout valves, ditches and dikes or whatever for product overflow and other things that can still maintain some degree of safety or limit the damage of an event, but require a much more significant investment of resources and effort in order to adequately contain and have hazards such as venting product and similar items. So the safety layer that you see here represents where the SIS steps in to try to make sure that bad things don't get significantly worse to when they become harmful or potentially dangerous things. So interacting with or manipulating such a device within these networks represents a very brazen attempt to enable not just physical damage, but also potentially putting plant operators and employees at risk should adverse conditions manifest. However, as we look at Triton, the intention of this event was likely to, again, breach the environment, access the OT environment, compromise the plant network as well as the safety network, deploy Triton, and then use Triton as a way to modify the safety logic within the environment so that some change in the DCS network would propagate beyond the safety layer to induce a destructive event. That would be very, very bad and probably would result in someone getting hurt, if not killed. Unfortunately for the actors, and fortunately for us, at the moment that Triton was deployed, instead the SIS faulted, and in fact it kind of operated like it's supposed to, and that it shut the plant down. So certainly a very costly, a very expensive situation, but a far cry from the worst case scenario of having something like an explosion or other harmful event take place within this environment. Precisely why this is the case is not completely clear. So certainly, as with all the virus bulletin presentations, please do check the paper for additional details on this. We only have a short time today to discuss. But important to note that, again, the adversaries screwed up or didn't take note of something. And as a result, Triton, though still scary, was not as bad as it could have been given the capabilities deployed and the networks that were targeted in this incident. But it didn't stop there. So about a year after Triton was announced to the world in approximately November of 2017, the folks at Mandiant released a report that not only provided additional details about the intrusion, but also importantly provided some attribution, linking the event to a Russian research facility, the Central Research Center, or Center for Chemical and Mechanical Research. We'll get into them very shortly. But what was interesting about this report from an intelligence perspective is the language that was used. Specifically, most likely is strange. That's not exactly your typical confidence interval or estimate of language being used. So it was unclear whether this was just the attackers happened to use some tools and preliminary parts of the operation that happened to be linked to some employees of this research institution, or if this institution was materially involved. It was an open question at the time for many, given lack of evidence in other items. But what was interesting about this reporting is that it started to give us at least a name to this threat actor. So while Mandiant has called this Temp Velis, which you don't really see that often, and so that's why I'm using the XENOTIME marker instead, because that's been more popularly used, more frequently used in public reporting, and that's the label applied by Dragos. But what's interesting is that for such a significant and important threat, these are the only references that we see to this entity. No bears, no APTs, no TAs, or anything like along those lines. It's really been an under-investigated and under-explored threat when it comes to multiple vendors, and you could make the argument for, well, Triton was a one-of-one event. We just don't have that much data, right? Well, not necessarily, because we see follow-up actions linked to the same adversary or elements of this adversary happening shortly thereafter. So Mandiant reported on intrusions that they linked to this actor going on in parallel with the Triton event, as well as other events that they were responding to as an incident response company. Dragos was able to identify targeting in the electric sector as well as the oil and gas industry, representing a shift in this adversary's targeting to additional industry verticals beyond the original oil and gas targeting in the Middle East. So it seemed like this entity was becoming much more profligate or much more confident in its abilities and spreading into additional industry verticals and additional regions, including North America and potentially Europe as well. But then things got really interesting, especially on the attribution front, when the United States Department of the Treasury, Office of Foreign Asset Control, OFAC, sanctioned not just a government, but a very specific organization, namely the Central Scientific Research Institute of Chemistry and Mechanics, who will be referred to henceforth as SNCCM, because it's a funny way of saying it. And it's also the only how I've seen it referred to in a lot of circles when referring to this institution, so SNCCM it is. The important part about this, though, is what the US government initially linked SNCCM to. Not writing Triton, not even deploying Triton, but rather building customized tools that enabled the attack. That's a very narrow slice of the overall intrusion, and kind of tied back into the original Mandiant reporting that was only able to satisfactorily link the intrusion to some of those enabling tools as opposed to the ICS capability itself, or to the actual execution of that capability within the victim environment. So it seemed like we were still operating at a half-measures degree at this point without really knowing who was responsible for the events in question. But then things got really interesting. Just this year, actually, in March, although this indictment was originally released but not publicly disclosed in 2021, the United States Department of Justice indicted not just the lab, SNCCM, but a specific individual, Yevgeny Gladik, who is mentioned by name multiple times within this indictment as being not just involved with this intrusion, but as the person who was hands-on keyboard, according to this indictment, for breaking into the environment and even deploying the Triton framework on the safety controller in the victim environment. This report also disclosed that there was a 2018 attempt in the United States on the oil and gas industry that, although it didn't result in any sort of disruptive event like we saw in Saudi Arabia in 2017, nonetheless represented a desire on the part of the adversary to map out and attempt to gain access to critical national infrastructure within the United States along similar lines to what was observed in Saudi Arabia. So when it comes to specific attribution statements, it doesn't get much more specific than this. And this indictment, while it's not the most exciting reading, is interesting to see that there's a precise timeline given of Mr. Gladkick's actions in terms of when tools were deployed, when certain tools were executed, leading up to the 2 attempts to execute Triton within the victim environment in Saudi Arabia. So at this stage, we can make a fairly safe assumption that Schnickem and this individual were involved in what took place. However, what's interesting about this indictment is that it still limits the responsibility for the Triton event to the execution of the attack, the development and deployment of certain custom tools used in the attack, but says nothing about who developed Triton other than that Gladkick was the individual that deployed it. So an ongoing mystery over that responsibility. Again, this is in much greater detail in the paper. Please check it out if this is interesting to you after we're done. But we see that XENOTIME represents not just an entity responsible for this Triton event in 2017, but rather has a history of actions going back to the first times that some of the enabling tools, the very specific custom tools that were used in the 2017 incident, were developed in 2014, all the way through expanded operations in 2020 and 2019 targeting the electric sector and other critical infrastructure outside of the Middle East. So an actor that's been fairly active, that has tried a very spectacular attack in at least one known incident, but still failed and has some degree of immaturity given what we saw in the Triton event not quite succeeding as it was likely planned. So where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us with multiple entities pointing to a single organization linked to the Triton incident. Mandiant, the US Department of the Treasury, and the US Department of Justice. It is interesting, given the amount of attention on Russian Nexus cyber operations, especially since February of this year, that we have not seen additional reporting from other organizations such as the UK NCSC or others tying this to Russian operations. And this entity, as far as we can tell, has not been linked to any operations in Ukraine thus far. So we're really left with a very narrow view of just what Schnickem is and what their responsibility remains within the overall scope of Russian cyber operations. But before getting into that in greater detail, we have to ask ourselves, what is this lab? We know GRU, we know FSB, we know SVR when we talk about Russian cyber operations. We don't hear this name very often except in the context of the Triton incident. So this is from its website. It looks like they have a very nice building, so that's pretty cool. They've been around for a while, though. So since the 19th century, where this organization worked to develop smokeless powder for the Russian army, the then Imperial Russian Army, and has remained through both the shift to communism and then in the post-1989, 1991 timeframe is still an active part of the Russian military complex. In looking at Schnickem, they have responsibility for a number of items. Explosive research, going back historically to their roots, to things like space weapons, advanced chemistry and metallurgy, and similar items. Very much reflective of what we would also see in organizations like the US National Laboratories or other such institutions that combine basic scientific research with military or national security applications. What was interesting about the US indictment, though, and in naming that one specific individual as responsible for deploying the Triton tool, is that there's a very specific organization within Schnickem called the Applied Development Center, ADC, that, at least according to the public website, is responsible for things including the defense of critical national infrastructure from cyber threats. In the United States government indictment, they emphasize that this public record of work on cyber defense is also linked to a non-public offensive cyber operation linked to that institute as well. What is interesting about all this, though, is that this website is no longer available. It was taken down not that long after Mandiant initially reported on Schnickem's link to the Triton event, and then this website was no longer available publicly for anyone to look at. So that may be a data point that's worth revisiting, but certainly very curious. But most importantly, we see Schnickem as having a role based upon our 3 primary data sources, the Mandiant reporting, the Department of Treasury sanctions, and then the Justice Department indictment, as developing support tools, performing the intrusion, including a line-by-line recreation or walkthrough of what Gladkick did on console in the event in 2017, and then executing the Triton tool. But what's very interesting about this sequence of events is that we don't see any mention of the Triton development here at all, whereas we would expect based upon the nature of the organizations involved, a scientific research laboratory that also happens to do cyber-related research and planning, you would expect this organization to be the entity that actually developed Triton. Yet no mention of that development anywhere, even though we were able to identify certain other IT-based enabling tools as developed by this institution. So very curious. If you read line by line through the indictment, there are some choices in wording that are a bit ambiguous and leave some room for interpretation as to who is responsible for what and whether or not other entities beyond SHNICM may have been involved in the event. Again, I refer you to the paper for additional details there. So we can't rely on these sources, as sparse as they are, as being definitive statements about what XENOTIME is and what organizations were involved. But it does give us a clue that it seems that this is more than just the single research laboratory that was engaged in this intrusion. So Triton and XENOTIME, what does this look like? Well, King Triton here, and I try to keep this fairly above board with no memes, but I had to get this guy in. Certainly we need to develop a capability, develop a tool such as Triton that is able to work, ideally, in the targeted industrial environments, a non-trivial ask and something that is not very easy for many organizations to accomplish or succeed within. But then in addition to that, you need to breach the target. So you need your initial access team to phish the organization, move laterally, gain persistence within the victim environment, et cetera. Not something that you would ascribe to a malware author who does things like reverse engineer a safety controller or similar system. And finally, need to deploy that capability within the environment itself, which, given the distinctions between IT and OT operational technology environments, is a non-trivial distinction. While there are many similarities with IT systems, there are also very important differences where having specialized knowledge may not just be desirable, but critical to ensure mission success. And perhaps this is one reason why the Triton event failed at this execution phase. Now, it is interesting to look at this because these represent vastly different capabilities in terms of function, knowledge, and experience required in order to take these on. And so we have to ask ourselves, is it realistic, is it even likely to anticipate that a single unitary entity, whether that be the specific individual named, Yevgeny Gladkik, or the ADC as a specific organization, or even SHNICM as a whole, was responsible for each phase of these operations? And that doesn't even get us into who told them to do this, because presumably this research laboratory was not operating on its own accord, but was tasked to develop this tool and deploy it in an environment by someone who was legally or otherwise responsible for giving such tasking to these sorts of organizations. So this gets us into a position where we're seeing a very complex interaction of capabilities as well as authorities involved in order to execute an event such as this. And if you look further, you'll see that there's an entire ecosystem, and this is just focusing on Russia. There was a report that released earlier this week on cyber test ranges in the People's Republic of China, for example. The United States, as I mentioned earlier, has organizations like the National Labs, excuse me, the DOE National Laboratories, organizations like MITRE, the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, recently responsible for helping to shoot down an asteroid, which is pretty cool. But in the Russian context, there's an entire series of labs, institutes, and public-private partnerships that provide capability enhancements to Russian intelligence, military, as well as specifically cyber operations. What's unique about these organizations, though, if we start looking at this as it relates to Russian cyber actors overall, is typically we see these organizations operating in support roles for various entities within the overall ecosystem of Russian threat actors. So FSU Gvant is associated and has been linked in other government indictments to the Federal Security Service, the Specialized Security Computing Devices and Automation Institute, to the Foreign Intelligence Service. And then this Federal Service for Technical and Export Control is the entity that maintains responsibility for SHNICM among other organizations and is tied to Russia's Ministry of Defense. What's unique about these, though, is that while we can see a very definite relationship in terms of providing expertise and capabilities in support of these organizations, we don't see something like providing the actual operators that are breaking into victim environments and deploying what is essentially a cyber attack tool within that victim environment, which is very unique and potentially very concerning in that we may be dealing with a ecosystem of threat actors that goes beyond this typical big three of FSB, SVR, and GRU, to also include various public, private, or institutional actors that have different command and control, different lines of authority, as well as different ways of operating than the adversaries that we're more used to interacting with. So what does that mean? Well, it means that cyber operations are pretty damn complicated. If any of you have done offense to any extent or red teaming, you'll know that doing it effectively is not easy, especially when we're talking about complex environments and targeting things like critical national infrastructure and operational technology environments. Thus, we would anticipate there to be some division of labor among various parties to achieve complex outcomes. The development of a tool such as Triton would go to one organization, the breaching and surveillance of the victim organization to some other entity, and then the actual execution of the intrusion and the attack to some third entity, perhaps. So as a result, we can look at this as a case study that, perhaps our reliance on associating single entities like XENOTIME to intrusions as complex as the event such as Triton, as well as subsequent intrusions globally, leaves something to be desired, and that one actor is rarely responsible for all phases of intrusions like we've seen in this particular case. So if we were to revisit Triton, we could assess with pretty high confidence, based upon the sources available to us, that XENOTIME does not represent a single unitary actor, let alone just this one named individual from the US Department of Justice indictment, but rather represents a link, potentially a one-time link, among various organizations, including SHNICM and the ADC, used to achieve this objective in Saudi Arabia for reasons unknown. That makes things pretty dicey, and you may be asking yourself, like, isn't this just so much cyber threat intelligence, arcane trivia or whatever at this point, and what does this really matter for the practice of cyber threat intelligence and responding to such events? Well, first, looking at XENOTIME, we can see this as a composite of multiple entities with a range of actions associated with it, probably revealing a complex interrelationship with various groups likely residing under Russia's Ministry of Intelligence, potentially involving the Military Intelligence Organization, or GRU, which part is unknown. But the thing is, we still don't know a lot of critical elements of XENOTIME activity. Who tasked them to take this action in Saudi Arabia? Who's responsible for tasking XENOTIME to do further probing of critical infrastructure in Europe and North America? And how this entity might actually behave or operate in the context of a conflict like we see in Ukraine presently, and more worryingly, potentially elsewhere, as we see with the Nord Stream pipelines, that things seem to be getting a little out of hand. But why does any of this matter to us? Well, it matters because we need to improve our understanding of events in order to appropriately categorize and figure out just what is going on. That means understanding and accepting that cyber operations are not the functions of unitary actors. That just as, if we were to say, the National Security Agency in the US, it has tens of thousands of employees. It is not just an agency, but represents multiple organizations operating under one authority. The same for the Ministry of State Security in the People's Republic of China, the same for Russian cyber operations, whether we're talking under the Defense Ministry or under internal security. And so we need a greater appreciation and understanding for how these complex adversaries emerge and what that means for how they can interact and basically combine in coalitions of the willing, or of the necessary, given the mission at hand, with different organizations to enable different effects. The result is that attribution becomes really frickin' hard. Attribution's already a complex problem. I'm not saying don't do it, but I am saying be very careful with doing it. But this mix and match approach of different organizations collaborating in different phases of intrusions means that attributing based upon only one aspect or one observed aspect of an intrusion means that we are likely missing the grand picture in terms of just what capabilities are brought to bear to enable these sorts of operations and what that means in terms of tracking campaigns and subsequent actions moving forward. In tracking something as specific as a piece of malware, we may be tracking the capability development entities while completely missing the initial access and lateral movement groups responsible for enabling these intrusions to begin with, which arguably is much more important from a defensive perspective. Thus, as threat intelligence professionals, unitary attribution and naming may be inappropriate, and we should look for these sorts of interconnections as much as possible to come up with a more accurate and realistic approach to how we identify and track these sorts of adversaries. And so for CTI analysts, that means that our jobs have just gotten a bit harder. We need to accept that and move on and try using what sources are available to us to unearth as many of these links and responsible parties as possible to gain an accurate view of just what is going on. So that's all that I have, and I'm right at time almost. Again, please check out the paper if this was interesting, as it goes into much greater detail on a lot of the items that I discussed, as is intended at Virus Bulletin. If you have any questions, I think we have time for maybe one or two, and feel free to stop me in the hallways or at the reception this evening if you'd like to discuss further.
Well, thank you, Joe. So that said, are there any questions from the audience? It's difficult to see with the light. Up here, can you please wait for the microphone?
Do you think the splitting up between the agencies are going to be more common nowadays from the
Yes.
malware perspective?
Yes, I would agree. We even see it in criminal ecosystems with initial access brokers plus ransomware affiliates and the actual ransomware controllers operating in terms of complex criminal enterprises, where different parties specialize in various parts of the overall cyber kill chain, or whatever you want to phrase it. And if we're talking about things like very complex state-sponsored operations, like trying to physically damage an oil and gas production facility, we're talking about a non-trivial combination of very specialized capabilities that would be unrealistic to expect all housed not just within one specific shop as part of an organization, but even potentially within one organization itself.
Any other questions? No? So I have one. You actually said that attribution is hard, and you had the ecosystem of the whole event. Mm-hmm. With so many groups involved.
Yes.
How difficult is it that you are really sure to attribute it to this one,
yes,
rather than that they have copied ideas or code from another group?
No, that's an excellent question. In fact, I wrote a paper on this subject last year that was presented at the first Cyber Threat Intelligence focus group. It's published through Domain Tools if anyone's interested in the detailed argument. But yeah, the answer is that you have to be very careful. And that's why when we get primary source documents, so that's a combination of first-hand technical data like incident response reporting from Mandiant, and then the government disclosures, which, again, we have to ask ourselves, okay, we can't just blindly trust that the US government or the British government or the Czech government or whomever is getting everything right 100% of the time. But for these entities to make public statements in these fashions typically gives us a sense of security that they wouldn't make this sort of statement without having fairly firm evidence on their side, just for fear of embarrassment or what it would mean to get it wrong. And by combining these sources, we can come up with a composite view of events that could allow us to make, still with estimative language involved, statements linking these sorts of incidents to specific parties. But it doesn't happen very often where we can get as specific as we potentially have in this case.
Okay.
So, anything else?
Any last question?
The only other thing I will say is Happy St. Wenceslas Day for those who are Czech, and thank you for everyone for the event, for working on a holiday. We really appreciate it. And yeah, thank you. And also resources.
Well, join me in thanking Joe.